I'm Paul Owens, opinions editor of the Orlando Sentinel. Orlando is still reeling from the deadliest mass shooting in U.S. history. The June 12th massacre at the Pulse nightclub that left 49 innocent people dead and more than 50 others wounded. Today we have three guests to talk about gun policy in the wake of that terrible tragedy. We have Patty Brigham, who's the gun safety chair for the League of Women Voters of Florida. To my left, your right, we have Catherine Grant, State Affairs Director of the Campaign to Keep Guns Off Campus. And we have Carlos Smith of Equality Florida. Patty, I'm going to start with you. A coalition has formed. Is it in the wake of this tragedy, or was it together prior to the tragedy?
It's been in the wake of this tragedy. The League of Women Voters of Florida has been advocating for responsible gun legislation for the past 2.5 to 3 years. We formed an active statewide gun safety committee. But since the shooting, we knew that we had to act and coalesce organizations and groups around the state. Thus far, we have about 53 organizations, including some national groups like Doctors for America, States United to Prevent Gun Violence, and Catherine's group, Campaign to Keep Guns Off Campus.
Uh-huh. And what is the coalition specifically seeking at this point?
This past Monday, we delivered a letter to Governor Scott, Senate President Andy Gardner, and House Speaker Steve Crisafulli. And in this letter, we announced our coalition, the Florida Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And we've made a request that they call a special session of our legislature within 14 days. The deadline would be July the 4th. And that they address two legislative pieces that are urgently needing to be addressed. One is an assault weapons ban, and the second being expanding background checks to close the gun show loophole and the internet loophole.
Now, there are some other states at this point that do ban assault weapons. Do you know those states, or how many there are?
I think there are 7 or 8.
They're actually listed in the letter: California, Connecticut, New York, as some examples. Mm-hmm. And this idea isn't new. Mm-hmm. Banning dangerous things like assault weapons at state level obviously has been tried before and very successfully. Mm-hmm. So we believe that this is an appropriate response to a growing epidemic of gun violence in our state, and obviously in response to the tragedy at Pulse.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, of those states that have assault weapons bans in place, are any of them led by a Republican governor or governed by a Republican legislature?
I would have to check to see exactly when the California ban was instituted, and I would say that might have been under a Republican governor. So I can't answer that specifically. I mean, obviously New York and Connecticut would be representative of Democratic governors. Mm-hmm. Could be.
Yeah. Yeah. The Florida legislature, for folks who have been following them the last few years, the trend in the Florida legislature has been toward expanding gun rights mm-hmm. rather than restricting or placing restrictions, mm-hmm. no matter how reasonable advocates might consider them. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, what is the realistic expectation of action from a legislature mm-hmm. that has a long record, or at least a record stretching back the last decade or so of mm-hmm. expanding gun rights?
Well, we do know the past 2 years that we have beat back 2 or 3 very bad gun bills. This year, campus carry, open carry, and a stand your ground expansion. So as Catherine knows, and Carlos, it is possible to beat the gun lobby in its backyard. And we've been doing that in Florida, and we intend to continue, because our coalition is not going to stop on July 4th. We are going to continue to expand it to bring the attention of this issue to the greater public, that the fact is that our legislators really need to be answering to the public and not to the special interests of the gun lobby.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and to Patricia's point, What we've seen in the last legislative session is the first legislative session in recent memory where the NRA has not gotten every single thing that they wanted. And that is in a Republican-led and dominated Florida legislature. We saw the campus carry bill failed, was killed in the Florida Senate. The same thing happened to the attempts to expand Stand Your Ground. Same thing happened to the attempt to bring open carry to the state of Florida. The reason that's changing is because voters' attitudes in Florida are changing. The political landscape is changing with Florida Senate redistricting that has basically put some Republicans in a more moderate perspective that they want to advocate for things that their districts care about, which is not anymore a super red Republican district. Many of them are competing in more moderate districts, so that's kind of changed the politics around this. And certainly this recent massacre is now a call to action to not just to bring us in a new direction and at less of a defensive position, but put us in an offensive position where we're now broadening the coalition of the usual communities who have been advocating for gun safety laws. This is an issue that is now across the spectrum, not just disproportionately impacting the Black and African American community, but also the Latino community. A super majority of the 49 victims at Pulse Massacre were young Latino men. They were also mostly LGBTQ, so now the LGBT community is starting to coalesce around gun safety, and that's really important that we broaden the coalition, because with a broader coalition there's more political power, and it doesn't just apply to ethnic or minority communities. It's very important now that the tourism industry adds their voice to this effort, and the reason why is because Orlando, even before this massacre happened at Pulse nightclub, is beginning to be perceived by the Florida community, by the United States community, and the world community as a city that's plagued with gun violence, no longer as a city that is a family-friendly destination for people to bring their loved ones to the theme park to enjoy our restaurants and our hotels. And that, again, happened before this shooting. It's a epidemic. We saw in the first 6 months of 2016 that there were 50 homicides in Orange County in the first 6 months. 40 of those homicides were the result of gun violence. We saw the singer from The Voice who was killed only 2 days before at the plaza right here in Orlando before the Pulse massacre. Gun violence is plaguing our community, and the tourism industry now needs to step up and join us because it affects their bottom line.
And I'd also like to add that it's not just the gun safety groups that are getting involved. As a part of our coalition, we have the Florida PTA, the Florida Council of Churches, and I think it's very important that we emphasize how the faith community is now stepping forward. The Islamic community, Muslim community rather, the Jewish community with the National Council of Jewish Women, a number of different Christian groups, are all coming together and saying, we've had enough of a run-amok gun culture. It's time to put some reasonable legislation forward.
Catherine, Carlos mentioned that this was an attack that targeted a gay nightclub on Latin night. Two distinct populations there involved. You've done some research on the impact of gun violence on different groups. You want to tell us about that?
Well, what we know to be true, and this is across the board in the use of all types of guns, but that minority communities, particularly Black and Brown communities, there's a disproportionate impact on those communities. We know that guns are used obviously in suicide. The numbers around suicide are extremely concerning, and the reason why guns are used is because of their lethality, obviously, success rate. And within that population, we're looking at young people. So again, between the ages of 18 and 24, we're seeing skyrocketing incident rates of suicide. So when we talk about gun violence, obviously we're talking about it within the context of, you know, the tragedy last week, but there are broad implications. And our hope is that we are able to have appropriate discussions around this with our lawmakers, bringing in experts in fields. There are a lot of smart people in Florida who can lend their perspective on the impact of guns on a college campus or in a school, and other policies that have been proposed in the state that you've been talking about, expanding Stand Your Ground. Obviously, we strongly oppose that. But if you get a bunch of smart people in the room together with lawmakers who are receptive and open to having a robust debate, then I think it could produce policy that is not only good for the community in the state, but has inputs from both sides of the aisle.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned, Patty, a couple of goals, legislative goals. One was an assault weapons ban, and one was is it proper to characterize it as universal background checks?
Expanded background checks, yes, because there's a problem right now with going into a gun show. If you buy from a federally licensed dealer, that dealer has to run a background check. However, the private collector who goes into a gun show and sets up his or her collection can sell, they're not licensed, can sell a weapon and not run a background check. So just who is buying those guns? We have no way of knowing.
I could see how the Orlando massacre would certainly be used by advocates of an assault weapons ban as an argument for that. But the shooter in Orlando submitted to a background check and passed a background check. So where is the nexus between the argument for expanded background checks and the Orlando massacre?
Well, first of all, no one needs one of these military-style weapons. They don't belong in civilian hands. They were created to be used by the military. And if someone goes into a gun show and fails to, if they don't have to have a background check, they're going to be able to get one of these weapons when they really shouldn't be. So it's not just those, yes, you know, there are those who pass the background checks and they go on to do terrible things. But we have to be preventative. We can't be constantly reacting. We've got to prevent future tragedies.
I also wanted to add too, and maybe Carlos can jump in on this piece, that, you know, in the context of this discussion with what happened last weekend, what we're seeing is that this type of weapon is able to inflict the maximum amount of damage.
Yes.
So whether he passed a background check or not, this weapon was largely responsible, if not completely responsible, for the number of fatalities that we saw. So that's really the issue here, is that these types of weapons are manufactured specifically with the intent of fine-tuning the technology to destroy as efficiently as possible. Do we think that it's a good idea as a community to allow people who may or may not have passed a background check to have access to these weapons?
Well,
Our
this
feeling
trend
is no.
started in the late 1980s when gun manufacturers began manufacturing semi-automatic assault rifles, which are really, at this point, weapons of mass destruction. When you look at the AR-15 model, or the variation of the AR-15 model, this is the same style of weapon that was used in Sandy Hook. It was used in Aurora, Colorado. It was used, a variation of it, a more modern day version or new age version of the AR-15 was used here at Pulse nightclub. This is not a Second Amendment issue.
No.
We support the Second Amendment. There is no legitimate civilian purpose for a weapon like that to exist, which is why the coalition is focused like a laser beam on banning assault weapons in the state of Florida, the sale, manufacture, transfer, and purchase, including the high-capacity magazines that go with it, because there's just no imaginable purpose for why a civilian would need to have access to a weapon of mass destruction, such as a semi-automatic weapon, other than to inflict maximum casualty in a mass shooting environment like we saw at Pulse.
is a state-by-state approach ultimately going to keep weapons like that out of Florida if they remain legal in Georgia and Alabama and other states? I mean, should you be focusing on Congress rather than the Florida legislature?
Well, look what's happening in Congress. Nothing is happening. I mean, we see positive signs like the sit-in, but no, we have to focus on what we can do in the state of Florida. We have to focus on making all of the residents and those who visit our state. Disney World is right here in our backyard. We have to make sure that our visitors and our residents are safe. Now, yes, you make an excellent point, about bringing a gun across state lines, but we have to focus on what we can do here. We can't control what is happening in the federal government.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the other point that you will hear from opponents on this is that any man who would walk into a bar with the intent of shooting dozens of innocent people is not going to be deterred by a law that prevents him from carrying a particular weapon if he can get his hands on the weapon.
Well, that's exactly what our call to action is it's to prevent someone like this deranged gunman who is a radical American homophobe, is what he was, from being able to purchase it. If you stop manufacturing these weapons, if you stop making them available to the public for them to use for no reasonable civilian purpose, then they won't have access to those weapons. Sure, the state of Florida is where we need to start. Is it better to not have a patchwork quilt of different laws in different states? Absolutely. But look, this is about making it harder for criminals and deranged maniacs like this gunman to have access to it.
And what about the assault weapons that are already in circulation? I've heard figures of something like 10 million that are in circulation in the United States.
Well, I mean, certainly what the proposal that we are putting forward and what we are asking for, which is the flat-out ban on the sale, purchase, and transfer of these weapons, is the start. We don't know exactly. This is going to be in the legislature's hands if they can call a special session for how they're going to deal with the existing weapons that are out there. That is part of the conversation, and it's part of the dialogue that needs to happen. But the flat-out ban is the starting point for sure.
And what would you say to those folks who, including our governor, who have argued that this is the issue here is not the availability of guns, it's terrorism. The shooter in Orlando claimed allegiance to ISIS and to the leader of ISIS as he carried out the attack.
Well, you said it just right. He claimed allegiance to ISIS and claimed allegiance to radical Islamic terror. But based on what we've seen so far and based on the stories that we have heard, back to my original statement, the guy was a radical American-born homophobe who specifically targeted LGBT people, who specifically targeted a Latino night and had an axe to grind with that community. I don't know exactly what his motivation was, whether this was some sort of internal hatred, some type of internal homophobia that perhaps was directed inward, or it may have simply been a homophobia that was directed outwards at others. But the bottom line is that while the LGBT community needs to understand, we have a lot of work to do to be able to finally to have real acceptance across the spectrum with all different communities, including religious communities. The reason something like this really happened is not because anti-LGBT animus is on the rise. It's not. It's on the decline. It's because the gun and the laws that we have are so permissive to someone who has a radical idea like he had and who basically have the ideology of hate just kind of brainwashing their minds that they have access to weapons of mass destruction. That is the real problem.
And I would like to add that isn't every mass shooting an act of terrorism? Wasn't Sandy Hook an act of terrorism, domestic terrorism, a hate crime? The fact is that we have a gun problem in our country, and we need to start dealing with that issue. We've turned our country, our states, into a battlefield. People dying every single day from gun violence, not necessarily mass shootings, but domestic violence shootings, suicides, as Catherine pointed out. There's just, there has to be a stopping point.
Does your do your priorities go beyond assault weapons and background checks? Would you like to see anything done on other kinds of guns, pistols?
I would say that right now, as Carlos said, we are laser focused on these two proposals regarding the assault weapons ban and the expanded background checks. That is our laser focus right now, that we believe address the issues that address the kinds of guns in crisis situations, address the kind of lax laws we have that can be used the way we saw at the Pulse nightclub. Our coalition going forward, we are not going away. We will remain fluid and continue to address proactive gun legislation. Frankly, it's really time for that in Florida. It's really time to stop being on the defensive and fighting bad gun laws, but to start putting forward good, smart proposals. We are not anti-Second Amendment. We believe in responsible gun legislation. This should not be a partisan issue. This is about gun safety. It's about responsible gun ownership. It's about public safety. Because
you will, of course, run into opposition from people who fear a slippery slope in gun regulation.
That's always the argument. That's always going to be the argument.
Yeah, it always will be, because since 1998, gun manufacturers have spent close to $40 million on lobbying state legislatures and Congress. That is an exorbitant amount of money to help them advance their radical right-wing agenda. But the reality is that we, as a coalition, are laser focused on these two proposals to ban these assault weapons and also make sure that we have expanded universal background checks, because they are achievable goals. They are supported by a supermajority of the electorate who stand with this coalition, that these are common sense gun safety proposals that must be enacted to protect our public and keep our communities safe. The polling and the electorate in Florida is also with us against some of these pro-gun measures. 70% of Floridians reject the idea of allowing students to bring guns on college campuses. The only reason this continues to happen is it is an intentional political distraction by the Florida legislature, who does not want the conversation to be about background checks. They don't want it to be about sensible gun reform. They want to distract the entire public with proposals that people don't even support, that the own members of the NRA don't even support. It's a distraction.
That's right. 74% of NRA members support expanded background checks.
Catherine, in the time that we have left, are there any lessons that can be drawn from other states that have preceded Florida in passing some of these limits that Patty has talked about? What led to action in other states, and what leads to action in Florida, as far as you're
I
concerned?
think, the example that everyone would probably be most familiar with is what happened in Connecticut after Sandy Hook, and in New York, also in neighboring states. So where we are now is that obviously there have been a number of different measures to restrict access to guns. So in general, what we have found over and over again is that limiting access to lethal weapons by those who, by any reasonable standard, should not have them anyway, reduces gun violence. So here in Florida, we believe that we will see the same thing happen, is that we are going to restrict people who shouldn't have a gun in the home or shouldn't have access to a gun for a variety of reasons, and we're going to see a drop in gun violence rates.
And where do you see the role of the governor in this?
I see it as and I'm going to quote John Lewis here from the floor last night in the extraordinary demonstration of concern on the U.S. House floor. I hope that he sees this as a moral responsibility. And I hope that he sees this as an accountability that he has towards the people of Florida who have elected him and who have entrusted the public safety of our state to him.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And where are our state officials on this? We're not hearing from them. The eyes of Florida, the eyes of really the nation and the world are on them. Why aren't we hearing from them? What are they doing? Why aren't they listening to the people of Florida? Why aren't they addressing gun violence?
Well, we need to at least have a dialogue. As a member of the coalition, Equality Florida is standing with everyone who's calling for gun safety measures, but Equality Florida has also reached out directly to the governor, and we have requested a meeting with the governor so that we can have a dialogue and we can talk about how Florida's entire community, but also how the LGBTQ community in Florida can move forward from this tragedy, and how we can work together to make sure that something like this does not happen ever again. We are waiting to hear back from the governor. We certainly expect, because he has been impacted by this tragedy. We've seen it on his face. We've heard it through his words that he's made publicly, that we expect he will, in the very least, meet with the largest LGBT civil rights group in our state after this horrific hate crime massacre against our community.
Okay. Well, we are just about out of time. I'd like to thank the three of you for joining us today. For the Orlando Sentinel, I'm Paul Owens.